I think one of the biggest things I've learned from making games with AI is that the hardest part isn't necessarily doing the code. A lot of the time, I think the hardest part is knowing what you actually want. Because when people talk about using AI to make games, the focus is usually on the technical side. Can AI write the code? Can it fix bugs? Can it build systems? Can it replace tutorials? And obviously, that stuff matters. And obviously, from my experience, I can't relate to typing out lots of code because I've never done it. So that's obviously one thing. But what I find is that a lot of the time, the biggest difference is actually the clarity of the idea. How clearly can you describe and understand what you want from the game? Do you know how the gameplay should feel? Do you know what should happen when the player presses the button or when an enemy takes damage, etc.? Because AI can help you build those things, but it still needs direction. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. And this is also why I believe that people that are still doing the traditional route, I don't necessarily think are going to get replaced by any means. I think a lot of it is going to come down to creativity and the idea itself. Because for me, it's not necessarily the case of typing make this cool feature or make this thing, and then suddenly it works and suddenly it means that it's a great game. It doesn't really feel that close to that. Most of the time, it's more like having to translate the idea in my head into something clear enough that AI can work with and clear enough to the point where I actually see it working well with the game. And that's the process which I've been trying to get better at. The first thing I try and do is really just understand the idea myself, right? And I mean, that sounds kind of obvious, but I think it's easy to skip. Because although AI does make things easier to implement, again, if it's more of a feature for the game and not something that's actually going to contribute usefully to it, then it doesn't really matter. And there's been even things which I've been having to learn, such as the whole UI with games, right? How do you put together, the visuals and the HUD of the game without making it look like it's a complete mess? And I've obviously been trying to work on that. And that's not really something at the moment that AI can necessarily go and fix, or know exactly what to do immediately. So there's obviously a lot of questions with that. But I think really the main thing is asking yourself, does this actually make the game better? Because one of the strange things about AI game development is that just because things are easier to build doesn't mean it's easier to well, it also means that things are easier to build that you don't actually need, right? You can make more things, you can add more abilities, more mechanics, and it can feel exciting because damn, you're moving quickly, but it doesn't really matter if you just add a game that had lots of stuff in it, but if it doesn't really matter. And I sort of noticed it when looking back on Scarred Steel, which is my first game I made. Because there are definitely things which I did make, which I ended up removing, which I didn't really need. And I think there are still a few features in the game at the moment which I now look back on and think, well, we didn't really need that. So that's obviously something I'm still trying to be more aware of. Because obviously, just because AI makes something possible doesn't really mean it's worth doing. So, obviously, in this case, clarity really matters before the prompt even starts. And once I do know what I want, then the next step is usually describing it. Now, a lot of the time, in this case, I'll use voice chat with ChatGPT for this. I found that it's easier because I can just talk throughout the ideas. These can be really, really long, and sometimes it's just trying to get the words out. But instead of necessarily having to sit there and type things out to get the perfect prompt, it's just so much easier for me to just speak things out loud and speak my thoughts out loud. And what's most important is just being able to actually describe things, right? If I can say what I'm trying to build, or if I can describe how I want it to work, if I can explain what scripts I want to be involved, or what to change, or what the outcome should be, then that's what's really important. And honestly, I think AI is only as useful as the context you give it. If you give it barely any information, I can't really be surprised if the result isn't what I wanted. So when I'm trying to get AI to help me do a feature, I try and give it as much context as I can. And one of the things I do really quite like doing is being able to give examples, right? So for example, funnily enough, I could say, instead of saying make this type of ability, I could say when, I don't know, this gladiator takes damage, I want there to be a 30% chance for this ability to trigger. Or I could say when X happens, do Y. And there's plenty of other sort of ways of going about doing it. But again, as like the better context you can give it, the better outcome you're going to get from it. And this can be from small prompts to very big prompts. But what I really know is that, giving AI something specific to work with so it knows the condition, it knows the chance, it knows the result, it knows the limitations, that's the ideal. It could be things, if this ability is active, then this stat could change. If the player does this, then the enemy should respond like this. That sort of thing where, from a coding perspective, is probably fairly complicated. But when you can describe it well enough and when you can play test it and see it happening in action or see it not happening in action, then it gives you the next steps in terms of what you then want to do. And, I might start describing a feature and then stop part way and realize that there's a part of it I don't quite understand yet. And when that happens, I don't necessarily jump straight into the game engine. I don't necessarily immediately give it that prompt and see what happens. Sometimes I'll just decide, you know what, I need to actually brainstorm this a bit more, right? I might use ChatGPT outside of Cursor and talk through the idea before I even look at giving it any sort of prompts, because I'd rather I had clarity first than anything else. And, I think AI is obviously useful for coding, but I think it's also really useful for thinking. I don't know how much you use AI in your day to day life, but for me, I really like it as a way of being able to brainstorm ideas, be able to organize my thoughts, because a lot of the time, there's a lot of things going on, with, I guess, life, but also with the stuff I do that can just be useful to go and implement. And, I've talked about this more in other videos, so I'm not going to go too deep with the workflow here when it comes to using things like Cursor. But really the basic idea is that I'm using AI like Cursor to outsource a lot of the coding, not the thinking, not necessarily the design, but more so the actual writing of code. Now, I believe Cursor can also edit like scriptable objects and things within Unity, which is also kind of cool. Like one of the prompts I gave it was to like reorganize the files in my sort of Unity project, and it actually did that very nicely. So there's a few things that it actually can do within Unity, which is still quite nice. Now, this isn't necessarily automated game development, although it can seem like it is. You do still need to put in work, which is surprising to a lot of people. And it's very difficult to describe and show. I think probably the only way for you to know how, the work you need to put in for AI game development is simply to go and do it yourself, which a lot of people probably don't want to do. But that's pretty much the way I think of it as well. But yeah, I mean, at the moment, I think it has been really quite good in terms of just being able to use AI to put ideas into the game. And a lot of the time, sometimes AI is going to misunderstand what you want. Maybe you didn't explain it properly, and maybe the code has an error in it. But I think patience is really a massive part of using AI as well. Obviously, game development, you want to have patience regardless, but I can't speak too much on that because I'm going the AI route. But I think really, if you want everything to work instantly with AI, especially with AI game development, you're going to get frustrated very quickly, because even with having spent probably about a year doing AI game development, I still get errors, I still get things that don't work as well, and sometimes I need to spend far more time on something than I really hoped I wanted to. In my case, I'm using Unity, but for example, like even things such as if I get errors in the console log, it's very easy for me to just copy all that, paste that into Cursor, and usually it gets things fixed within the first or second try. And that's one of the parts of AI game development that really does feel powerful to me, because traditionally, if you had an error and you didn't really know what you meant, you'd probably have to go through tutorials, forums, documentations, and try and figure out what was going wrong. And I'm not necessarily thinking that's a bad thing, right? That's obviously how a lot of people learn properly. But for me, with the way I work, AI just keeps me moving, and it lets me focus on creativity and the ideas of the game, so I don't need to necessarily look at every technical detail. And that's probably just one of the biggest mindset shifts, right? I don't need to become a traditional programmer to make progress. And although it's not exactly a noble thing, I think really what matters is just be able to understand my game itself, right? I need to know effectively what sort of scripts are responsible for what, because again, the context really matters. And I think that's really where a lot of the skill actually is, not necessarily memorizing a lot of stuff, but also just more so understanding what you want from the game. What is the core gameplay loop, etc. And I think that sort of thinking really does help quite a lot, because no matter what AI tool you really use, a lot of it I think is just going to come down to how you can output it and whatever, right? Because I think probably it's more so around describing it better so that AI can implement it better. And I think really that's probably where the game has a better chance of actually becoming what, you can actually put in your head. So that's how I use AI to put complex ideas into my game. I don't necessarily just ask it to make things. I try to explain the idea clearly. I give it context. I use examples. I test what it gives me. I fix what breaks, and I stay patient enough to keep going until the feature actually feels right. That's not always necessarily easy, but for me, it's made AI game development possible in a way it never felt before. And that's the way I feel with it. I think with AI, for most people, they just feel skeptical. But for the few people that actually look at AI as an opportunity, I think whether it's things like game development or even other ventures with AI, I think there's plenty of opportunity. And yeah, I think a lot of it is just a matter of how well you can describe what it is that you want to do. And especially with AI game development, obviously it's a very touchy thing and obviously it's a very big project. But with tools, like Cursor, tools like, I don't know, ChatGPT for the image model or whatever it is, it's being able to build a bit of a system around that can really help. So that's all I really will say for that. If you are curious more about sort of how I do various things with AI game development, feel free to reach out. I do have a Discord as well, which you can reach out to me on there as well and discuss a few things. But with that said, I'll catch you soon.